Although the colonies developed distinct geographical and cultural regions, by the 18th century, what we see happening is that the colonies were developing a common identity as Americans because of certain shared experiences that they were feeling, and this common identity began to shape how the colonists looked at themselves. These common experiences involve rapid population growth. A second common tradition, common experience is a tradition of self-government and autonomy. All the colonies experienced this great religious revival known as the Great Awakening, and finally all of the colonies faced the war against the Indians and their French allies, culminating in the French and Indian War between 1754 and 1763. So what we're going to do now is to look at each one of these common experiences that the colonists possessed. One thing that they all shared was tremendous population growth. The population of the colonies grew tenfold in the 18th century. At the beginning of the 18th century, in 1700, it's estimated that there were about 250,000, or 250,000 colonists. By the time we get to the eve of the American Revolution in 1770, there were 2.5 million colonists. So that's a tenfold increase right there. And Philadelphia was the largest city, and its population of 35,000 in 1770 made it the second largest English-speaking city in the entire world, second only to London. So this tremendous population growth, one factor was large-scale immigration. You know, during the course of the 18th century, we see large numbers of English, Scots, Scotch-Irish, and Germans continuing to come in and settle in the colonies. And also, we have the continued bringing in of Africans to work as slaves in the southern colonies. Now, many of the people who arrived at this time, many of these immigrants, especially Scots and Scotch-Irish and Germans, they came as indentured servants. You've got to remember that whereas indentured servitude largely disappeared in the South, it continued especially in the middle colonies, like places like Pennsylvania and New Jersey and New York. Now, by 1770, on the eve of the American Revolution, just to have a breakdown of the population, it's estimated that probably about 60% of the people who lived in the colonies were of English ancestry. About 20% or so were either from Scotland or Ireland or Germany or some other European country, and about another 20% were African. Now, you got to remember that by and large, the vast majority of the African population lived in the South, and in the South alone. But it wasn't just immigration that was bringing in this huge population increase. Probably most of the population increase was due to a very high birth rate. And the reason why there was such a large birth rate was because of the availability of farmland. Remember, in places like the middle colonies and New England, 2/3 to 3/4 of the people lived on their own farms that they themselves owned. So there was, because you had large amounts of people compared to Europe who owned land and raised their own crops, there was an abundance of food compared to, let's say, Europe. And so what we see happening is that child mortality rates were very low in the colonies as compared to anywhere in Europe. You see, when you have a problem with food and malnutrition, children are the ones who suffer, and they usually are the ones who suffer from epidemic diseases because they don't have that defense. So if you have lots of food, that means that children are better prepared to defend themselves, their bodies anyway, to defend themselves from epidemic disease or death. So in America, you had a situation where more and more kids were growing up and are reaching adulthood and then starting their own families. So this really got the population increase just generating. Now, also, 90% of Americans lived on family farms. And on a family farm, having a big family is very important because your children are not just children, they're your free labor. The more kids you have, the more hands you have working the farm. So it was in the best interest of farmers to have as many kids as they could have, 8, 9, 10 kids. That was the norm, not having just 1 or 2 kids. Also in the colonies, it was actually possible for people to get married at a younger age. See, there was a tradition in Europe that said that you couldn't start a family until you had the means to support a family. And so with the availability of land in America, in the American colonies, a young couple, late teens, early 20s, they could go ahead and get married and start a farm and start having kids. So in the American colonies, women were starting to have children at a much younger age than over in Europe. And that means that their years when they could bear children were much longer in America than they were over in Europe. So for all these reasons, what we see happening is that a lot of kids were being born in the American colonies, and they were growing up and starting families of their own. Now, as generation was followed by generation, what we see happening is that these colonists more and more came to see their colony as their home, whether they lived in Virginia or Massachusetts or wherever they lived. That was their home. They were no longer Europeans transplanted to the New World. They were who they were. They were of the land they were born to. And so eventually we began to see these different colonists in these different colonies begin to see themselves distinctly as Americans. Now another feature we see, another common experience of the American colonists was that for most of the colonial period, they enjoyed self-government and autonomy. They paid little or no taxes to the British government. Now, this situation was by default, not by design. You see, from the very beginning, the English kings saw the colonies as a way to make money for themselves and for their kingdoms. You see, there was this general policy that was in place by the 17th century, this not so much a policy, but an ideal or a notion called mercantilism. Mercantilism was this idea that a state is only as strong as how much gold, precious metals they possess. The more gold a nation possesses, the wealthier and more powerful that country is. And so in this line of thinking, it was believed that by having colonies, you could acquire raw materials without having to pay for them from another state, and you could also get luxury goods from these colonies without letting money out of your country, and also you could collect high customs duties on imports. So mercantilism was the principle, and colonies were seen as a way to, based on the principles of mercantilism, for the kings and for the governments to make money. Now, Parliament actually passed, with the support of King Charles II, a series of laws called the Navigation Acts in 1660 and 1663 and again in 1673. And these laws were based on the principles of mercantilism. For example, colonists could only sell their tobacco and indigo to England. That was one regulation. Also, they could only transport their goods on English ships. And also, they could only purchase goods manufactured in England. In other words, these laws were designed to make sure that all the money that could be made went to the government of England, to the king. Now, I'll just give you an example of how things worked. In 1733, the Parliament passed the Molasses Act. And what they did is that they put a really high tax on French sugar from French colonies because they didn't want colonists to buy French sugar. They wanted them to buy sugar made by British colonies. You see? They wanted American merchants to only work with English colonies. So that was the system that was set up, and it was designed to make money for the English government. Now, also, from the very beginning, if you look at the colonies, there was a big difference between what the government, the English government, and the royal governors could do and what they actually did. Now, for example, you've got to remember that 9 out of the 13 colonies were royal colonies. And these are all colonies where the governor is appointed by the king or by the crown. Now, these governors, on paper, in theory, had a lot of power. Like they could summon the colonial legislature at their will, or they could dismiss the colonial legislature. When it came to appointing law enforcement, appointing sheriffs, or appointing judges, the governor had full authority to appoint whoever he wanted. Also, in almost all of the colonies except Massachusetts, and all these royal colonies, the upper house of the legislature, the council, was appointed by the governor. So he could appoint the members of the upper house of the legislature. So you look at the powers of the governor, you're thinking, boy, these governors, they have a lot of power, they have a lot of authority. The colonists should be directly under the control of the crown. But was that how it really worked? No, that's not how it worked. You see, in practice, in reality, what we see happening is that governors and royal officials actually exercise very little in power or authority over the colonists. And why was that? Because appointments to the government, appointments to these government positions was based on a system of patronage. Now, what was the system of patronage? Well, this system developed in England in the 18th century. And it developed in England in the 18th century primarily because the royal kings for most of that 18th century, King George I and George II, they didn't take a big interest in the day-to-day operation of the government of England. Both George I and George II, believe it or not, they could barely even speak English. They were both German dukes. So they spent a lot of their time in Germany, and so Parliament was pretty much left to its own devices. And what developed in Parliament was that the member of Parliament who had the most power and influence in Parliament, he would be asked by the king to form a government. And eventually this position became known as the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister would form a council of ministers. And the Prime Minister and this royal council, they were the acting government of England, while King George and George II did whatever they were doing. Now, the way that this system worked was that in order to win support of Parliament, in order to get support for their policies, the Prime Minister would buy people off. He would buy off members of Parliament by offering their friends and family jobs in the government. It's called patronage. That's what patronage was. So let's say you're Prime Minister and you want to get a law passed in Parliament. Well, you go to members in Parliament and say, look, I heard you got a cousin who needs a job. I'll give him a job. Oh, I heard you have an uncle who needs a job. I'll give him a job. And that's how they built support for their system. Now, what happened is that positions in the colonies, including the position of governor, became part of this patronage system. Now, this system really comes into place under the first real British Prime Minister, Robert Walpole. Now, so this is how it worked. Since these positions in the colonial government were not based on merit or ability or talent, they were just based on who you knew. Often the people who appointed to be a governor or appointed to hold any kind of position in the colonies, these people, some of them were incompetent. They didn't know what they were doing. They got the job because they had a friend or a cousin or an uncle who had influence in Parliament. So a lot of times these corrupt, incompetent officials, they did not enforce the law. So across the colonies, it became fairly common for smuggling to take place. It was just an open secret. Everybody smuggled to avoid paying the customs duties, and nobody paid the customs duties because you didn't have a government enforcing the law. So that became the norm, just continuing to smuggle. Also, governors, since the governors are often out to lunch or incompetent, it was really up to the legislatures to really run the colonial government. The elected legislatures were the real government because the governors were often no-shows. Now, another factor in all this was that even if, let's say a governor comes in and he's not incompetent, but you see, the way it worked was that if the governor's housing and the governor's salary came from the legislature. So it was in the best interest of a new governor to really reach out and to smooge with the legislature because they were the ones giving him his salary and his housing. So the way it really worked in the colonies was that the colonial legislatures were the ones who they met whenever they wanted. They weren't dependent upon the governor. They were the ones who appointed sheriffs. They're the ones who appointed governors. Usually the royal governor, not governor, judges. Usually the royal governor did what they asked him to do because his salary was coming from them. And when it came to appointments to the upper house, usually the governor would follow the recommendations provided by the legislature. So you had a situation where in theory the governors had great power, but in practice the colonial legislatures were the ones calling the shots. Now this situation is known to historians as benign or salutary neglect. It's neglect because basically the British government didn't give a hoot what happened in the colonies and allowed the colonies to do whatever they wanted. It's beneficial or salutary in the sense that it provided an opportunity for the colonists to run their own affairs and to enjoy the benefits of self-government. All right, so another important aspect, another important common feature of life in the colonies in the 18th century was this Great Awakening, as it's called. And the Great Awakening was a great religious revival that swept across all the colonies, beginning really in the 1730s and into the 1740s. And it affected the many Protestant churches. You've got to remember the vast majority of colonists were Protestants, and most of these Protestant churches were affected in some way or another by this religious revival. And it also saw, the Great Awakening also saw the emergence of a new Protestant church or denomination that still exists today, the Methodist Church. Now, one of the inspirations for the Great Awakening in America was a man by the name of John Wesley, and he was a minister in the Anglican Church. As a young man, he had come to Georgia with James Oglethorpe to preach to the Creek Indians. And when he got back to England, he decided that he needed to preach the Word of God to the unchurched. So what he did is he went out into the countryside, he went into the mining towns, he went into the growing factory towns that were beginning to emerge in the middle of English, the Midlands of England and central England, and he began to preach. And since a lot of these places didn't have churches, he would often preach in these big outdoor revivals. They'd set up a big tent. Heard of tent revivals? That's where you get this. They'd have set up a big tent, and thousands of people would come to hear the Word of God, to hear John Wesley preach. And he was a great preacher. And one of his messages was that people needed to be born again. He felt that there was too many people who were just going to church because they had to, or going to church because it was customary to go to church. He wanted the people to go to church because they were filled with the love of Christ. And he wanted them to become sanctified. By sanctified, that means he wanted them to be born again into Christ and to be sanctified to living a Christian life. And the teachings of John Wesley became known as Methodism. Now, John Wesley was mainly preaching over in England. Now, he had a disciple and a follower named George Whitefield. And George Whitefield, he decided that he was going to take the message of Methodism, take the message that John Wesley was preaching and bring it to the American colonies. So what he did was a tour of the colonies. He started in Georgia and he went all the way up into New England. And thousands of people came to hear George Whitefield preach. And there were tent revivals and revivals all over the colonies. And one thing that came out of this revival was all kinds of new churches were created. And these became known, the churches that were created that were inspired by Wesley's teachings became known as Methodist churches. And in a lot of the back country, from Pennsylvania all the way to the Carolinas, a lot of the back country, that's where these new Methodist churches were often founded at this time. Now, the Great Awakening was marked by these religious revivals that were very, very emotional, and people crying and people being born again, and just it was a very emotional, spiritual experience. Now, it turns out that what Wesley and Whitefield started, it started a wave, and there was a very prominent man by the name of Jonathan Edwards. He lived up in Massachusetts, and he was a congregational minister in the Congregational Church, and he also, like Wesley, was kind of shocked by how people were no longer just into church anymore. They were just going to church because they had to. Now, he was someone who was very much into the Christian faith. He had decided to, instead of going to Harvard, which his father had been a minister, he was expected to go to Harvard, he went to the newly established Yale University in Connecticut. And Yale was a hotbed of religious revival, and it was considered to be more Christian and less worldly than Harvard. So he went to Yale. In fact, later in life, he was the president of Yale University. But when he started preaching, he began to preach about revival. And when he heard George Whitefield preach, that inspired him to go out preaching revival among the congregational churches all over New England. So he really started a movement inspired by the example set by the Methodists. Another prominent preacher was a man by the name of Gilbert Tennent. Now he was a Presbyterian, and he was from Pennsylvania, and he began to preach across to the Presbyterian churches in the Middle Colonies in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and he went by 1740 he was even going into New England, and he was also preaching at huge revivals and getting a lot of attention. In fact, the followers of Tennent decided some years later to found the College of New Jersey, later known as Princeton University, as a Presbyterian seminary to train new ministers in this new fervent Presbyterian, revived Presbyterian faith. Now, among the Protestant denominations, Presbyterians, the Congregational Church, among these congregations, there was a big split because some churches really bought into this whole idea of this spiritual, emotional revival. And these people were called the New Lights because they embraced the emotion, the preaching, the people getting down on their knees, people crying, people just filled with the Spirit. And some people in the churches were a little turned off by that. They thought that was not appropriate. So you had some conservative churches who said, hey, enough of that. We don't want anything to do with that. Now some denominations weren't affected at all by the Great Awakening, like the Anglicans and the Quakers. They continued to go on business as usual. And it didn't affect the Roman Catholics at all. So it was mainly among a good number of the Protestant denominations that the Great Awakening had its biggest effect. Now what was the impact of the Great Awakening on colonial society? Well, there's a couple of things that happened here. One thing was that it actually created a kind of an American spirit, because what the Great Awakening did was to cut across cultural lines. You got to remember that traditionally people who were English were Anglicans, people who were Germans were Lutherans, people who were Scottish were Presbyterian. In other words, your culture determined your church, you see. But with the Great Awakening, you had a situation where people were called by the Spirit to join whatever church they felt appealed to them, which they felt the Spirit of God. So you had a situation where Germans were joining the Methodist Church, and you had Englishmen becoming Presbyterians. So what the Great Awakening did was to cut across these cultural lines that had divided the colonists. Also, the Baptist Church grew among all different cultural groups. Another thing about the Great Awakening was that it built a sense of commonality among the various Protestant denominations that were affected by it. You see, the one thing that united all the different churches that were part of the Great Awakening was this belief in a personal relationship with Christ, this idea of being reborn and being born again. And so this was a theology that cut across denominations and came to unite Americans and develop among Americans a kind of a common evangelical faith that would become an important part of the American identity. Another aspect of the Great Awakening was that it weakened the influence of churches as institutions. You got to remember that before the Great Awakening, people went to church because they had to, either because it was a matter of law, like in Virginia, you were required to go to the Anglican church, or out of tradition or custom. Everybody went to church because that's what your parents did. But what the Great Awakening said was that people should go to church as they felt called by the Spirit. It was an individual choice. It was an individual choice what church to belong to. So churches didn't have that same institutional power. Instead, the individuals went to the churches that they felt called out to them. And so what the Great Awakening did was to really strengthen the idea that one's personal religion was personal, that people should have freedom of religion, that people should be able to go to the church that they want to rather than just go to church because it's mandated by law or by custom. Another thing about the Great Awakening was that it began to make people question authority. Instead of just listening to a minister because he's a minister of the established church or the institutional church, people began to believe that you needed to have a minister who was accountable to God, that if a minister wasn't authentic, that he wasn't worth his weight. And also people began to think that they didn't have to go to church just because the government mandated. So for example, in Virginia, Virginia Baptists refused to go to the Anglican Church because they didn't want to go to that church because they were Baptists. So what we see is that the Great Awakening was, this is significant, the Great Awakening was making people question authority based on their individual beliefs, and that would be an important, considering that this all happened on the eve of the American Revolution. All right, finally, another common experience that the colonists all shared was that they all were afraid of Native Americans. I mean, that sounds terrible, but that brought them together, was this fear of the Native Americans, which were, in their view, were seen as bitter savages, as uncivilized barbarians. Now, between 1689 and 1763, many of these Native American tribes were allied with France and against Great Britain, and they fought a series of wars against one another. Now, these wars were not just for control of North America, but they're also in control of India as well, so it was a worldwide struggle. So how did the French get involved? We haven't really talked about how the French got in North America. The settlement of French North America actually goes back to a French explorer by the name of Samuel Champlain. He established the first colony at Port Royal in Acadia, which is today Nova Scotia, in 1604, and later he established in 1608 on the St. Lawrence River the settlement at Quebec. So Quebec was established just 1 year after Jamestown. So the French have been in North America almost as long as the English. Now, eventually, by the course of the 17th century, due to the actions of French explorers, the French claimed the entire Mississippi Valley, from the Great Lakes all the way to New Orleans. In fact, the Gulf. In fact, Louisiana, this whole territory from the Great Lakes to New Orleans, the entire Mississippi Valley was named Louisiana in honor of the French king Louis XIV. Now, by 1750 or so, the French population in this area of Louisiana and New France, as it was called, was about 80,000. So there are a lot fewer French than there were English. I mean, there were like 2.5 million American colonists, but there were only about 80,000 French colonists. Now, it turns out that the French were very successful in establishing links with Native American tribes, and that's one reason why Native American tribes tended to ally themselves more with the French than with the British. For one thing, the French colonists and fur traders established very strong trading connections with various Native American tribes, and to the point where it was often customary and a tradition that Native American women marry French trappers and French colonists. So the French had established strong relationship with the Native Americans, and so the Native Americans and the French were often allies in these series of wars that pitted the French Empire against the British Empire. And these wars that were fought coincided with a series of wars that were fought in Europe, in continental Europe. And in these wars, usually France would be allied with one side and Great Britain to the opposing European alliance. So, for example, Queen Anne's War that was fought here in the colonies coincides to a war in Europe called the War of Spanish Succession. King George's War, which was fought 1744 to 1748, that coincides to a war in Europe called the War of Austrian Succession. So you had these wars going on in Europe, you had these wars going on in the colonies. Now, for most of the time, these series of wars ended in a draw. I mean, they were not conclusive. Neither side gained any advantage. But that all changed with a war called the French and Indian War between 1754 and 1763. This French and Indian War coincided with a great war being fought in Europe called the 7 Years' War. Now, this war actually began because the British and the French were fighting for control of the Ohio River Valley. Both the French and the British were claiming control of this area. Now, in around 1754, the French sent forces to a place called Fort Duquesne. Now, Fort Duquesne is what is today Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but it opens up the entire Ohio River Valley. And what happened is that there was actually a battle fought there. See, when the French established themselves at Fort Duquesne, British forces went to investigate. And the commander of those British forces, who were mainly Americans, was none other than a young George Washington. But that battle at Fort Duquesne started a war between France and Great Britain. Now, in this war between these two sides, the British were led by the Prime Minister at the time, William Pitt. Now William Pitt is sometimes known as the father of the British Empire because he believed very strongly that the British, using the superior navy, could acquire a huge overseas empire in North America and India, and that it was essential to defeat the French to achieve this goal. And he was willing to borrow huge sums of money. He borrowed money from the Bank of England, which was mainly controlled by English investors. In other words, he was borrowing money from his fellow citizens who had invested in the Bank of England. So he was borrowing huge sums of money and then using that money to build up the British Army and the British Navy. William Pitt was also very good at entrusting command of his armies to effective generals. And the results paid off. You see, in 1759, first of all, British forces captured Quebec. Quebec was the capital of New France. So the capture of Quebec in 1759 was a terrible blow to the French. And just 4 years later, in the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the French admitted defeat. And it was a great victory for Great Britain. The French agreed to surrender all of their possessions in North America except for little Haiti in the Caribbean, but they lost everything. And Great Britain acquired a huge empire, and also Great Britain also at this point acquired Florida. Spain, who had been France's ally, they gave up Spain. So as a result of this war, Great Britain was victorious and they had acquired a huge empire. Now this war really served to unite the colonists from all the different regions and to help to see themselves as being Americans. For one thing, what united all these colonists was their fear of Native Americans. And also the fact that the Native Americans were allied with the French. You see, the French were Roman Catholics, and the vast majority of Americans were Protestants. And because of this traditional distrust between Catholics and Protestants, many Americans equated Catholicism with savagery, with butchery, with superstition, with tyranny. And now they saw these evil Catholics, as in their view evil, of course, align themselves with the savage Indians. And in fact, these wars were very bloody. I mean, the Americans weren't just making this stuff up about being scared of Indians. In fact, just to give you an example, Chief Pontiac, who was the king or the chief of the Ottawa Nation, he had organized a confederation of Indian tribes even after the French had decided to give up the fight. And this confederation wreaked havoc. You know, in 1763, it's estimated that some 2,000 Americans were slaughtered from a region stretching from Pennsylvania all the way to Virginia. And it was only after a lot of deaths that the Ottawa Indians and Chief Pontiac were defeated. So you can see that Americans, they were very afraid of Native Americans, you know, the killings, of the slaughtering and all that. So that united Americans. Another thing about the war was that Americans volunteered to fight in this war, and the colonies agreed to put up money to fight the war. In fact, in 1755, representatives from the colonies met at the Albany Congress. This was the first time that representatives from all the colonies had ever come together in one place. And the purpose of the meeting was so they could work together to coordinate efforts to fight the French and the Indians. So you can see that the war was actually, for the first time, bringing people from different colonies together to work together. In fact, Benjamin Franklin, who was a delegate from Pennsylvania, he actually proposed a plan for union to bring a unity to all the different colonies. The plan wasn't approved, but here we see that Ben Franklin one of the founding fathers, was already thinking about how can these colonies unite and come together. Another important thing that happened during this war was that Americans really began to see that they were, in fact, different than English people from the British. I mean, they weren't just transplanted Englishmen. A lot of times, this was the first time that Americans had come face to face with large numbers of British soldiers and their officers. And one thing they noticed was that a lot of these British soldiers were very immoral. See, a lot of times the British Army would basically go in and find people in prison and put them in the Army. That's how they recruited. They would go to empty the prisons and say, oh, you're in the Army now. So not all of these, but a lot of the British soldiers who came over weren't, a lot of them were petty thieves or had been in jail. They weren't exactly moral paragons, and Americans were shocked by their behavior. What shocked them even more was how arrogant their officers were. You see, the officers in the British Army came from the ranks of the aristocracy, and they looked upon everybody as being inferior to them. So Americans, they didn't think these officers were any better than they were, yet they were treated with disdain by these officers. So that really planted a seed among Americans that maybe there's something about these British that makes them a little different than Americans, and that Americans were maybe a better sort of people. Now finally, the last thing is that during the war, the British government began to actually collect customs duties. And Americans didn't like that because they were used to not paying them. So that began to create some problems. Now, as we'll see, this control by the British government, this effort to reestablish control after the war was over, that would breed among Americans a lot of fear because they were so used to benign neglect and used to running their own affairs. And when the British government began to exercise more control over the colonies, that began America on the road to seeking its independence. And that's something we're going to talk about in our next lesson.